Sophie never expected a simple message to stir something so deeply inside her. Life, for the past few years, had been quiet. Too quiet. After losing her husband, she'd retreated into a shell of routine and silence, the kind of silence that lingered in the corners of every room. Her stepson, Tyler, now in college, came and went with a casual rhythm, bringing along bursts of laughter, energy, and the occasional noisy group of friends. Among them was Aiden, a tall, thoughtful young man with kind eyes and an almost old soul. Sophie had noticed him before, though she never allowed herself to think too much about it. There was something about the way he spoke to her. The way he offered a small smile when everyone else was too distracted to even notice her presence. While most of Tyler's friends barely acknowledged her beyond a polite nod, Aiden always greeted her properly, asked how she was, and lingered for just a moment longer than the rest. He wasn't flirtatious, just present. And for someone like Sophie, who had long felt invisible, that presence meant more than she dared admit. One ordinary Tuesday afternoon, as sunlight slipped lazily across the kitchen tiles, Sophie's phone buzzed with a message that stopped her in her tracks. It was from Aiden. The text was short, polite, but filled with a strange kind of weight. "Hi, Sophie. I was wondering if you'd like to come over. I have something I want to show you." She read it 3 times. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but confusion. Why would Aiden invite her over? It wasn't just unusual, it felt personal. A part of her wanted to ignore it, to protect herself from misinterpretation or disappointment. But another part, the quiet voice inside, her that hadn't spoken in years, whispered go. She sat with the phone on her lap for over an hour, her heart dancing between hesitation and curiosity. Was it innocent? Probably. But why did her chest tighten at the thought of seeing him alone? After what felt like a lifetime, Sophie finally typed a reply. "Sure. What time?" The simplicity of her answer didn't reveal the storm she felt inside. As evening approached, she got ready slowly, carefully. She didn't dress up, just a light sweater, a touch of lipstick. But everything felt different, like she was waking, up after a long sleep. When she finally stepped out and drove to his apartment, she kept rehearsing what she'd say, what she'd ask. But nothing prepared her for the feeling that came when Aiden opened the door. He stood there, calm and composed, with a gentle smile that made her feel oddly at peace. The apartment was small but cozy, filled with the smell of coffee, books, and something artistic. Sophie's eyes swept across the room, noticing little details, the scattered paintbrushes, a sketchbook flipped open on the table, soft music playing in the background. "Thanks for coming," he said, his voice low and genuine. She nodded, still unsure of what this was. "So, what did you want to show me?" she asked, her voice quieter than she intended. Aiden moved toward his desk, lifted something carefully, and turned it toward her. It was a painting. Her painting. Sophie stared, breath caught in her throat. It was her, sitting on the front porch of her house, wearing her old green shawl, looking out into the distance with eyes filled with something unspoken. The detail was stunning, the emotion raw. "I started this months ago," Aiden said softly. "I don't know why, but you stayed in my mind." Sophie stood frozen, overwhelmed, unable to understand how someone so young could see her. Not just her image, but her essence. And in that quiet, fragile moment, everything began to change. Sophie stood still, her eyes locked on the painting as if it held a secret she hadn't known about herself. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. It was her face staring back, yes, but there was more than just a physical likeness. Aiden had captured something deeper, something hidden, even from her. The quiet ache in her eyes, the way she sat with her shoulders just slightly slumped, the expression of someone who had grown used to fading into the background. The green shawl, wrapped around her shoulders in the painting, looked almost like a protective shield, and the way the porch light spilled across her figure gave it an almost ethereal glow. She couldn't remember the exact moment Aiden had seen her like this, but he clearly had. He must have been watching from afar, observing her not in a creepy or intrusive way, but with a kind of gentle reverence. Aiden stood nearby, his posture calm but respectful, as though he understood that the painting had stirred something in her and didn't want to intrude on the moment. She glanced at him then, not quite able to hide the disbelief in her eyes. "Why me?" she asked, her voice quiet but laced with emotion. Aiden looked at her with a softness that unnerved her more than anything else. "Because you're different," he said. "Most people don't even notice the way someone like you carries so much silence. But I did. I saw strength in it. And sadness, too." Sophie felt her throat tighten. She didn't know how to respond. She was used to polite conversations, empty compliments, the usual small talk people offered widows to keep things light. But Aiden wasn't treating her like someone fragile. He was treating her like a woman, complicated, layered, human. She slowly stepped back from the painting, afraid of how exposed she felt. "It's beautiful," she finally said, barely able to hold his gaze. "You're very talented." He smiled, but not proudly, more like someone grateful for being seen too. "Thank you, but it wouldn't exist if it weren't for you." They sat down then, across from each other, with the painting still standing between them like a third presence in the room. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. In fact, it was strangely intimate. Sophie found herself noticing small details about Aiden, how he absent-mindedly rolled the edge of his shirt between his fingers, how his eyes stayed focused but never intense. There was something grounding about him, and yet, the entire situation felt surreal. Her heart was racing in a way it hadn't in years, not from danger or excitement, but from something more delicate, possibility. Aiden broke the silence first, as if sensing her thoughts. "I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable. That wasn't my intention." Sophie shook her head quickly. "No, you didn't. It's just, no one's looked at me like that in a very long time, or noticed me enough to paint me." He leaned forward slightly, his voice lower now. "You deserve to be seen, Sophie, not as someone's mom, or widow, or background character. Just as you." The words struck something deep inside her. She felt her guard faltering. But with that vulnerability came fear. She suddenly stood, needing distance to breathe. The air had shifted, charged with a current she hadn't prepared for. "I should go," she said, trying to collect herself. Aiden didn't argue. He simply stood with her, walking her gently to the door. Just before she left, he spoke again, this time with a clarity that stopped her in her tracks. "You don't have to be invisible anymore, Sophie. Her eyes met, his briefly, searching for a response, but she couldn't find the words. So she left in silence, her heart louder than ever before. The drive home was a blur for Sophie, her thoughts tangled in a whirlwind she couldn't seem to quiet. Every moment from Aiden's apartment replayed in her mind. The way he had looked at her, the gentle certainty in his voice, and most of all, that painting. It wasn't just a piece of art. It was a mirror she hadn't realized she needed. For years, Sophie had hidden herself behind the role of stepmother, widow, caretaker. Her feelings, her desires, her very sense of womanhood had faded into the background like an old photograph left in the sun. But tonight, something shifted. Something raw and unfamiliar stirred inside her. As she pulled into her driveway and sat in the quiet car, her hands still gripped the steering wheel. The house loomed in front of her, still and lifeless, waiting, like always. But for the first time in a long time, Sophie felt like she didn't quite belong in the silence. She stepped inside and wandered to the kitchen, her fingers brushing the edges of the counter absent-mindedly. The words Aiden had spoken, "You don't have to be invisible anymore," echoed louder than any noise. It was the kind of thing no one had ever said to her, not even her late husband during their best days. As she moved through the house, she stopped in front of the hallway mirror. She looked at herself the way Aiden must have looked when painting her, closely, with intention. The lines around her eyes, the softness in her cheeks, the distant sadness that clung to her features. She hadn't really studied her reflection in years. It wasn't vanity that had kept her away. It was indifference. But now, as she stared into her own face, she felt curious. Who was she now, outside the titles others gave her? That night, sleep didn't come easily. Her bed felt both too big and too small, and her thoughts kept returning to Aiden's voice, his eyes, the careful distance he had kept while still reaching something deep inside her. She didn't feel ashamed for being there, or even for the strange warmth his attention had sparked in her. But she did feel scared. Scared of what it might mean. Scared of being judged. Scared of waking up feelings she had long buried beneath grief and routine. She wasn't supposed to feel this way. Not about someone so young. Not about her stepson's friend. And yet, the ache in her chest told her that this was not something she could ignore. The next morning, Sophie tried to return to normal. She made coffee, opened the windows, and pretended the day was like any other. Tyler came by to pick up a few things and chatted briefly about classes and his weekend plans. He mentioned Aiden in passing, saying he had been working on something personal and hadn't been around much lately. Sophie froze at the mention, her heart jumping, though she kept her expression neutral. "Oh," she said softly, stirring her coffee even though she wasn't going to drink it. "That's nice." But inside, the realization struck her. She had become part of that something personal. It wasn't just a painting. It was something deeper. A connection she hadn't seen coming. Later that afternoon, after hours of walking through the park and trying to clear her head, Sophie found herself standing in front of Aiden's apartment again. She didn't even remember deciding to go. Her heart pounded in her chest, both nervous and strangely calm, like she was walking into something her soul had already chosen for her. She stood there for a long moment before lifting her hand and knocking softly. As the door opened and Aiden appeared, his eyes met hers with quiet understanding, like he already knew why she had come back. That night, after returning from Aiden's apartment for the second time, Sophie lay in bed, staring at the ceiling in the dark, completely still, as if movement might stir emotions too fragile to handle. Her mind replayed every word, every glance, and the moment his fingers had briefly brushed hers before she pulled away. She hadn't meant to go there. She told herself she only needed air, a walk, some time alone to think. But her feet had led her to him, as if drawn by something she couldn't name. The truth was, Sophie had spent years suppressing her own emotions, stuffing them into the corners of her heart where no one could reach them, not even herself. Since her husband passed, life had been a series of quiet sacrifices. She had focused on raising Tyler, making sure he felt secure, supported, loved, even though he was never hers by blood. She loved him as if he was. She gave everyone around her everything they needed, and somewhere along the way, she stopped asking what she needed. But Aiden, he saw her, not as someone's stepmother, not as a grieving widow, not even as an older woman. He looked at her like a person, a whole person. And for someone like Sophie, who had forgotten what it meant to be seen that way, the experience was overwhelming. As the night dragged on, Sophie let her mind wander to memories she usually avoided. She thought about how her marriage had changed in its final years, not in dramatic or cruel ways, but in the quiet erosion of closeness. Her husband had been a good man, but grief had drawn them apart long before death did. And once he was gone, she didn't feel broken. She felt numb. The kind of numbness that doesn't scream but settles into the bones and stays. And now, with one unexpected connection, one painting, one invitation, Aiden had stirred the numbness into something else. Longing. She wasn't foolish. She knew the age difference mattered, that people would talk if they ever found out. The fear of judgment crept into her thoughts, along with guilt. But the stronger feeling, the one that refused to be silenced, was this quiet, unfamiliar sense of aliveness. She hadn't felt like a woman in a long time, not in the way that made her heart flutter or her breath catch. And that feeling, while scary, was also deeply beautiful. The next day, Sophie moved slowly, as though walking through fog. She tried to distract herself with chores and errands, but Aiden's words wouldn't leave her mind. You don't have to be invisible anymore. Had she made herself invisible? Or had the world simply stopped looking? That question stayed with her as she cleaned, as she folded laundry, as she watched the light shift across the living room floor. When her phone buzzed, she hoped it was Aiden, but it was Tyler instead. He was stopping by to pick up a book and some mail. When he arrived, he mentioned Aiden again, casually. He's been kind of off lately, he said, scrolling through his phone without looking up. Said he's thinking about quitting his art classes. Can you believe that? Sophie's breath hitched slightly, but she said nothing. Aiden had never mentioned quitting. Had she done something by walking away? Later that afternoon, Sophie wandered outside. The world was still warm, with a soft breeze curling through the trees. She walked for a long time, trying to find peace, but it never came. Instead, it led her again to the sidewalk outside Aiden's apartment. This time she didn't hesitate. She knocked. And when he opened the door, there was no surprise on his face, just quiet understanding, the kind that made her chest ache. She stepped inside slowly, as if crossing a line she hadn't meant to, but no longer feared. She didn't know what would come next. But she knew this wasn't just a passing moment. It was something deeper, something that had already begun to change her. Inside Aiden's apartment, the atmosphere was different this time. Quiet but heavier, like the air had settled around something unspoken. Sophie stepped in slowly, her heartbeat rising with each step, as if her body already knew what her mind was still afraid to admit. Aiden closed the door gently behind her, not saying a word at first. He offered her tea, which she accepted with a quiet nod, grateful for the small gesture that gave them both time to breathe. They sat at the small table by the window, warm mugs between their hands. But their eyes kept drifting toward each other, glancing away just as quickly. There was no pretending this was casual anymore. The air between them was charged with something tender and complicated. Aiden finally broke the silence, his voice soft but steady. "I didn't expect you to come back," he said, not as a question, but more like an admission of hope. Sophie looked at him, her fingers tightening around the mug. "Neither did I," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I couldn't stop thinking about that night, about what you said, about the painting." Aiden leaned back slightly, the light from the window outlining the curve of his face. "I didn't mean to confuse you," he said quietly. "I know how this must look. I know what people might think." Sophie nodded, her throat tightening. "You're not confusing me," she said, then paused. "You're reminding me of something I thought I'd lost." Her voice cracked just slightly at the end, the vulnerability slipping through before she could catch it. Aiden's eyes softened, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Outside, the trees swayed gently in the wind, the world continuing its quiet rhythm, unaware of the storm brewing in two quiet hearts. Finally, Sophie looked at him directly. "I've spent so many years being careful," she said. "Careful with what I feel. Careful not to be too much. Careful not to get in anyone's way." She looked down. "But when I saw that painting, I saw a woman I didn't recognize. Someone with depth, with emotion. Someone worth seeing." Aiden reached across the table slowly, his hand resting lightly over hers. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was grounding, reassuring. "That woman is you, Sophie," he said. "Every line, every shadow. I painted what I saw in your silence. It wasn't just admiration. It was connection." Sophie's breath caught in her chest. She had never heard anyone speak to her like that, not even during the best years of her marriage. She felt exposed, but not ashamed. Instead, it was a strange kind of relief, like something she had buried long ago was finally breathing again. The space between them grew smaller, not physically, but emotionally. She could feel herself slipping toward something she hadn't prepared for, something that felt terrifying and sacred at the same time. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "I'm afraid of what this means. For you, for me, for Tyler." The mention of her stepson's name hung in the air, a silent barrier neither of them could ignore. Aiden nodded slowly. "I think about that, too," he said. "And I don't want to hurt anyone, least of all him." His eyes searched hers. "But I also don't want to lie to myself, or to you. There's something here, Sophie. I feel it every time you're near." she blinked away sudden tears, caught between guilt and longing. She hadn't come looking for this. She hadn't expected to find herself in the warmth of a younger man's eyes or to feel like a woman again, not a shadow of one, but she had. And now, they were both standing at the edge of something real, something dangerous, something beautiful. And neither of them seemed ready to walk away. In the days that followed, Sophie moved through life as if she were caught between two worlds, the one she had lived in for years, filled with quiet routines and emotional safety, and the new, uncertain space that Aiden had opened in her heart. She didn't speak to anyone about what was unfolding between them. She couldn't, not because it was shameful, but because it was fragile, too fresh, too tender to be placed under the harsh glare of outside opinions. Every day, she found herself thinking of him, of the way he listened, not just to her words, but to her silences, the way he made her feel like she was no longer fading into the background. And yet, guilt simmered beneath the surface. Tyler had no idea, and that alone made every moment Sophie spent with Aiden feel like a secret carved in glass. Beautiful, but delicate and dangerous. She questioned herself constantly. Was this real? Was it fair? Was it foolish? But every time she thought of pulling away, she remembered the way Aiden had looked at her, not with infatuation or fantasy, but with quiet reverence, like he saw her, truly saw her, and didn't flinch. One afternoon, while shopping for groceries, Sophie ran into an old friend of her late husband's. They exchanged polite small talk, the usual comments about how quickly time passed and how strong she'd been. But when the woman said, "You've done a good job staying devoted all these years," Sophie felt her chest tighten. She smiled and nodded, but inside, something cracked. Was that who she had become? A living monument to a past love, a woman frozen in time, wearing grief like a badge of honor? That evening, she sat in her garden alone, watching the sky shift through shades of gold and pink. She realized she didn't want to be defined by loss anymore. She wanted to be more than resilient. She wanted to be alive. Later that night, Aiden texted her simply, "Are you okay?" She stared at the message for a long time before replying, "Can I see you?" Minutes later, they were sitting side by side on his small couch, a quiet breeze slipping in through the open window. They didn't need to say much. Their silence was its own kind of conversation. Aiden turned to her, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to answer now, but I need to ask. Do you want this?" Sophie's heart pounded. Wanting wasn't the question. She did, deeply, painfully. But wanting something didn't always make it right. Still, after a long pause, she met his gaze and said, "I don't know what the future looks like. I just know that when I'm with you, I feel something I thought I'd never feel again." Aiden nodded, his expression soft. "That's enough. For now," he said. "I just want to be where you are, even if we have to move slowly." As summer deepened, they continued to meet, quiet, private moments, full of meaningful glances, unfinished conversations, and unspoken truths. Sophie began to write again in her journal, filling pages with emotions she hadn't dared to express before. She started noticing color again, how the sky changed at dusk, how music sounded in the morning. She laughed more, even when alone. One day, Tyler mentioned how much lighter she seemed. "It's good to see you smile like that," he said casually. And she smiled back, guilt prickling her skin, but gratitude warming her chest. No one else needed to know. Not yet. What she had with Aiden was still unfolding, still finding its shape. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't simple. But it was honest. And in a life filled with compromise and quiet sorrow, Sophie had found something rare. A connection that reminded her she was still a woman, still capable of love, still alive. The future was uncertain. But for the first time in years, Sophie didn't dread it. She welcomed it, with an open heart and a story that finally was her own.